everybody. All right, fantasy lesson number 3. Let's do it. All right, so today our objective is to focus on how when there's a problem in your story, oftentimes it leads to a new problem or many new problems. So I want you to think about a time in your life when you had a problem, right? You got it. Now think about, was it easily solved or were there some problems along the way when you were trying to solve it? So one thing that I think about is when I was 20, I was in Zanzibar. Here's a photo from Zanzibar, which is an archipelago off of Tanzania in Africa, Eastern Africa. And I was there on holiday from when I was teaching and with a couple friends, and I was not feeling well, so I went to the doctor. The doctor told me what I had, but I didn't agree because I'd already had that, so I decided, okay, I'm just going to go home, I'll go to sleep, maybe tomorrow I'll wake up feeling better. When I woke up, no good. I was not feeling well. It felt like a big hollow drum was in my stomach and it was pounding through my organs. Not good. So I decided, all right, I need to get out of here and I need to get to a hospital. My friends were already planning on this, but had already left for Zimbabwe that morning, and I needed to get to the hospital. The only one I knew was in Nairobi, Kenya. It was about a 12-hour bus ride away, and I knew there's probably no way I'm going to make it on that bus. So I went to ask somebody how to get an airline ticket. I was able to get that. Then I needed a ride, so then it led to a new problem because then I needed to get to the airport. I had no way of transport, so I convinced a guy to give me a ride on his motorcycle, and I got to the airport. When I got to the airport, it led to a new problem because they wanted to check all my luggage, but I was getting very sick. I was very nauseous, and I needed to run and use the restroom, and so when the woman said, I'm going to check your luggage, I just said, okay, take it. I don't need it. I'm going to go to the bathroom and be sick. She kind of looked at me and she's like, ew, I don't want to touch your luggage. And so, well, that problem got solved. So then I was able to take my luggage. Then I need to get on the plane. And I was so nauseous and so sick. The poor people that had to sit next to me because I would get up and go to the restroom, and then I would come and lay my head on the tray table. And then I got off, and then it led to a new problem because when I was going through customs, they wanted a bribe, and I don't know why at this point I decided to be feisty, but I was like, look at me. I'd actually had my head down kind of on the counter because I was really weak at this point. Like, look at me. I'm on the way to the hospital. You need to let me in. You know I have the paperwork. I need to go now. And for some reason it worked. And so I got in, solved that problem. Then I needed to get to the hospital, so I found a cab who gave me a ride to the hospital. I made it there. Then from there, I needed to check myself in and I had to fill out all this paperwork. But every time I was filling stuff out, I was having to run to the restroom and be sick. Finally I get in. It took, honestly, about a day and a half before they figured out what I had. I had pancreatitis, which means it's not very good. It's not very common that a 20-year-old would have it, but it feels pretty bad. And anyways, so I was able to stay in the hospital. They took excellent care of me. I was there for about a week, and then I was able to fly back home. And then I was okay. It took, though, a while to recover from chronic pancreatitis, but by the time I was 30, I was A-okay, and now I'm just fine. So anyways, I tell you that story to illustrate how when you have one problem, like, oh, you don't feel well, it can lead to many, 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 many more problems, right? And so I want you to pay attention to how the problems multiply. Another thing to pay attention to is how does the character, or how do the characters react when those problems happen? Because we know when there is a problem, how people react tells a lot about who they are, right? So today's kind of a long one. We are going to be reading and looking at chapters 4, 5, 6, 7 in The Thief of Always, and then afterwards we're going to talk about how the problems multiply in that story, all right?
tired than he'd thought, or the calm and comfort of the house rocked him into a slumber. Whichever, his eyes closed almost as soon as he put his head on the pillow, and they did not open again until morning. Chapter 4. A Death Between Seasons. The sun came to wake him soon after dawn, a straight, white dart of light laid on his lids. He sat up with a start, wondering for a moment what bed this was, what room, what house. Then his memories of the previous day returned, and he realized that he'd slept through from late afternoon to early morning. The rest had strengthened him. He felt energetic, and with a whoop of pleasure, he jumped out of bed and got dressed. The house was more welcoming than ever today. The flowers Mrs. Griffin had set on every table and sill singing with color. The front door stood open, and sliding down the gleaming banisters, Harvey raced out onto the porch to inspect the morning. A surprise awaited him. The trees, which had been heavy with leaves the previous afternoon, had shed their canopies. There were new, tiny buds on every branch and twig, as though this were the first day of spring. "Another day, another dollar," said Wendell, ambling around the corner of the house. "What does that mean?" said Harvey. "It's what my father used to say all the time. Another day, another dollar. He's a banker, my dad, Wendell Hamilton II. And me, I'm Wendell Hamilton III. How'd you know?" "Lucky guess. I'm Harvey." "Yeah, I know. Do you like tree houses?" "I never had one." Wendell pointed up at the tallest tree. There was a platform perched up among the branches, with a rudimentary house built upon it. "I've been working up there for weeks," said Wendell, "but I can't get it finished alone. You want to help me?" "Sure, but I've got to eat something first." "Go eat. I'll be around." Harvey headed back inside, and found Mrs. Griffin setting out a breakfast fit for a prince. There was milk spilt on the floor, and a cat with a tail hooked like a question mark, lapping it up. "Clue Cat?" he said. "Yes, indeed," Mrs. Griffin said fondly. "He's the wicked one." Clue Cat looked up, as if he knew he was being talked about. Then he jumped up onto the table and searched among the plates of pancakes and waffles for something more to eat. "Can he do whatever he likes?" Harvey said, watching the cat sniff at this and that. "I mean, does nobody control him?" "Ah, well, we all have somebody watching over us, don't we?" Mrs. Griffin replied. "Whether we like it or not. Now eat. You've got some wonderful times ahead of you." Harvey didn't need a second invitation. He dug into his second meal at the holiday house with even more appetite than he had the first, and then headed out to meet the day. Oh, what a day it was! The breeze was warm and smelled of the green scent of growing things. The perfect sky was full of swooping birds. He sauntered through the grass, his hands in his pockets, like the lord of all he surveyed, calling to Wendell as he approached the trees. "Can I come up?" "If you've got a head for heights," Wendell dared him. The ladder creaked as he climbed, but he made the platform without missing a step. Wendell was impressed. "Not bad for a new boy," he said. "We had 2 kids here couldn't even get halfway up." "Where'd they go?" "Back home, I suppose. Kids come and go, you know." Harvey peered out through the branches, upon which every bud was bursting. "You can't see much, can you?" he said. "I mean, there's no sign of the town at all." "Who cares?" said Wendell. "It's just gray out there anyway." "And it's sunny here," Harvey said, staring down at the wall of misty stones that divided the grounds of the house from the outside world. "How's that possible?" Wendell's answer was the same again. "Who cares?" he said. "I know I don't. Now, are we going to start building or what?" They spent the next 2 hours working on the treehouse, descending a dozen times to dig through the timbers heaped beside the orchard, looking for boards to finish their repairs. By noon, they'd not only found enough wood to fix the roof, but they had each found a friend. Harvey liked Wendell's bad jokes, and that "who cares" which found its way into every other sentence. And Wendell seemed just as happy to have Harvey's company. "You're the first kid who's been real fun," he said. "What about Lulu?" What about her? Isn't she any fun? She was okay when I first arrived, Wendell admitted. I mean, she's been here months, so she kinda showed me the place. But she's gotten weird the last few days. I see her sometimes wandering around like she's sleepwalking, with a blank expression on her face. She's probably going crazy, Harvey said. Her brain's turning to mush. Do you know about that stuff? Wendell wanted to know, his face lighting up with ghoulish delight. Sure I do, Harvey lied. My dad's a surgeon. Wendell was most impressed by this, and for the next few minutes listened in gaping envy as Harvey told him about all the operations he'd seen. Skull sawn open and legs sawn off, feet sewn on where hands used to be, and a man with a boil on his behind that grew into a talking head. You swear? Said Wendell. I swear, said Harvey. That's so cool! All this talk brought on a fierce hunger, and at Wendell's suggestion they climbed down the ladder and wandered into the house to eat. What do you want to do this afternoon? He asked Harvey as they sat down at the table. It's going to be real hot. It always is. Is there anywhere we can swim? Wendell frowned. Well, yes, he said doubtfully. There's a lake around the other side of the house, but you won't much like it. Why not? The water's so deep you can't even see the bottom. Are there any fish? Oh, sure. Maybe we could catch some. Mrs. Griffin could cook 'em for us. At this, Mrs. Griffin, who was at the stove piling up a plate with onion rings, gave a little shout and dropped the plate. She turned to Harvey, her face ashen. You don't want to do that, she said. Why not? Harvey replied. I thought I could do whatever I wanted. Well, yes, of course you can, she told him. But I wouldn't want you to get sick. The fish are poisonous, you see. Oh, said Harvey. Well, maybe we won't eat 'em after all. Look at this mess, Mrs. Griffin said, fussing to cover her confusion. I need a new apron. She hurried away to fetch one, leaving Harvey and Wendell to exchange puzzled looks. Now I really have to see those fish, Harvey said. As he spoke, the ever-inquisitive Clue Cat jumped up onto the counter beside the stove, and before either of the boys could move to stop him, he had his paws up on the lip of one of the pans. Hey, get down, Harvey told him. The cat didn't care to take orders. He hoisted himself up onto the rim of the pan to sniff at its contents, his tail flicking back and forth. The next moment, disaster. The tail danced too close to one of the burners and burst into flames. Clue Cat yowled and tipped over the pan he was perched upon. A wave of boiling water washed him off the top of the stove, and he fell to the ground in a smoking heap. Whether drowned, scalded, or incinerated, the end was the same. He hit the floor dead. The din brought Mrs. Griffin hurrying back. I think I'm going to go eat outside, Wendell said as the old woman appeared at the door. He snatched up a couple hot dogs and was gone. Oh, my Lord, Mrs. Griffin cried when she set eyes on the dead cat. Oh, you foolish thing. It was an accident, Harvey said, sickened by what had happened. He was up on the stove. Foolish thing, was all Mrs. Griffin seemed able to say. She sank down onto her knees and stared at the sad little sack of burned fur. No more questions from you, she finally murmured. The sight of Mrs. Griffin's unhappiness made Harvey's eyes sting, but he hated to have anyone see him cry, so he fought back his tears as best he could and said, Shall I help you bury him? In his gruffest voice. Mrs. Griffin looked around. That's very sweet of you, she said softly. But there's no need. You go out and play. I don't want to leave you on your own, Harvey said. Oh, look at you, child, Mrs. Griffin said. You've got tears on your cheeks. Harvey blushed and wiped them away with the back of his hand. Don't be ashamed to weep, Mrs. Griffin said. It's a wonderful thing. I wish I could still shed a tear or two. You're sad, Harvey said. I can see that. What I feel is not quite sadness, Mrs. Griffin replied. And it's not much solace either, I'm afraid. What's solace? Harvey asked. It's something soothing, Mrs. Griffin said, getting to her feet. Something that heals the pain in your heart. And you don't have any of that? No, I don't, Mrs. Griffin said. She reached out and touched Harvey's cheek. Except maybe in these tears of yours, they comfort me. She sighed as she traced their tracks with her fingers. Your tears are sweet, child, and so are you. Now, you go out into the light and enjoy yourself. There's sun on the step, and it won't be there forever, believe me. Are you sure? I'm sure. I'll see you later then, Harvey said, and headed out into the afternoon. Chapter 5. The Prisoners. The temperature had risen while Harvey had been at lunch. A heat haze hovered over the lawn, which was lusher and more thick with flowers than he remembered, and it made the trees around the house shimmer. He headed toward them, calling Wendell's name as he went. There was no reply. He glanced back toward the house, thinking he might see Wendell at one of the windows, but they were all reflecting the pristine blue. He looked from house to heavens. There was not a cloud in sight. And now a suspicion stole upon him, which grew into a certainty as his gaze wandered back to the shimmering tops and the flowers underfoot. During the hour he'd spent in the cool of the kitchen, the season had changed. Summer had come to Mr. Hood's holiday house, a summer as magical as the spring that had preceded it. That was why the sky was so faultlessly blue, and the birds making such music. The leaf-laden branches were no less content, nor the blossoms in the grass, nor the bees that buzzed from bloom to bloom, gathering the season's bounty. All were in bliss. It would not be a long season, Harvey guessed. If the spring had been over in a morning, then most likely this perfect summer would not outlast the afternoon. I'd better make the most of it, he thought, and hurried in search of Wendell. He finally discovered his friend sitting in the shade of the trees, with a pile of comics at his side. "Want to sit down and read?" he asked. "Maybe later," said Harvey. "First, I want to go look at this lake you were talking about. Are you going to come?" "What for? I told you it's no fun." "All right, I'll go on my own." "You won't stay long," Wendell remarked, and went back to his reading. Though Harvey had a good idea of the lake's general whereabouts, the bushes on that side of the house were thick and thorny, and it took him several minutes to find a way through them. By the time he caught sight of the lake itself, the sweat on his face and back was clammy, and his arms had been scratched and bloodied by barbs. As Wendell had predicted, the lake wasn't worth the trouble. It was large, so large that the far side was barely visible, but gloomy and drear, both the lake and the dark stones around it covered with a film of green scum. There was a legion of flies buzzing around in search of something rotten to feed on, and Harvey guessed they'd have no trouble finding a feast. This was a place where dead things belonged. He was about to leave when a movement in the shadows caught his eye. Somebody was standing further along the bank, almost eclipsed by the mesh of thicket. He moved a few paces closer to the lake and saw that it was Lulu. She was perched on the slimy stones at the very edge of the water, gazing into their depths. Speaking in a near whisper for fear he'd startle her, Harvey said, "It looks cold." She glanced up at him, her face full of confusion, and then, without a word of reply, turned and bounded away through the bushes. "Wait!" Harvey called, hurrying toward the lake. Lulu had already disappeared, however, leaving the thicket shaking. He might have gone in pursuit of her, but the sound of bubbles breaking in the lake took his gaze to the waters. And there, moving just below the coating of scum, he saw the fish. They were almost as large as he was, their gray scales stained and encrusted, their bulbous eyes turned up toward the surface like the eyes of prisoners in a watery pit. They were watching him. He was certain of that, and their scrutiny made him shudder. Were they hungry, he wondered, and praying to their fishy gods that he'd slip on the stones and tumble in? Or were they wishing he'd come with a rod and a line, so that they could be hauled from the depths and put out of their misery? What a life, he thought. No sun to warm them, no flowers to sniff at or games to play, just the deep, dark waters to circle in, and circle, and circle, and circle. It made him dizzy just watching, and he feared that if he lingered much longer he'd lose his balance and join them. Gasping with relief, he turned his back on the sight, and returned into the sunlight as fast as the barbs would allow. Wendell was still sitting underneath the tree. He had 2 bottles of ice-cold soda in the grass beside him, and lobbed one to Harvey as he approached. "Well?" he said. "You were right," Harvey replied. "Nobody in their right mind ever goes there." "I saw Lulu." "What did I tell you?" Wendell crowed. "Nobody in their right mind." "And those fish." "Yeah, I know," Wendell said, pulling a face. "Ugly boogers, aren't they?" "Why would Mr. Hood have fish like that? I mean, everything else is so beautiful. The lawns, the house, the orchard." "Who cares?" said Wendell. "I do," said Harvey. "I want to know everything there is to know about this place." "Why?" "So I can tell my mom and dad about it when I go home." "Home?" said Wendell. "Who needs it? We've got everything we need here." "I'd still like to know how all this works. Is there some kind of machine making the seasons change?" Wendell pointed up through the branches at the sun. "Does that look mechanical to you?" he said. "Don't be a dope, Harvey. This is all real. It's magic, but it's real." "You think so?" "It's too hot to think," Wendell replied. "Now sit down and shut up." He tossed a few comics in Harvey's direction. "Look through these. Find yourself a monster for tonight." "What's happening tonight?" "Halloween, of course," Wendell said. "It happens every night." Harvey plunked himself down beside Wendell, opened his soda, and began to leaf through the comics, thinking as he leafed and sipped that maybe Wendell was right, and it was too hot to think. However this miraculous place worked, it seemed real enough. The sun was hot, the soda was cold, the sky was blue, the grass was green. What more did he need to know? Somewhere in the middle of these musings he must have dozed off, because he woke with a start to find that the sun was no longer dappling the ground around him, and Wendell was no longer reading at his side. He reached for his soda, but the bottle had fallen over, and the scent of sweet cherry had attracted hundreds of ants. They were crawling over it and into it, many drowning for their greed. As he got to his feet, the first real breeze he'd felt since noon blew, and a leaf, its edges sere, spiraled down to land at his feet. "Autumn," he murmured to himself. Until this moment, standing beneath the creaking boughs, watching the wind shake down the leaves, autumn had always seemed to him the saddest of seasons. It meant that summer was over, and the nights would be growing long and cold. But now, as the drizzle of leaves became a deluge, and the patter of acorns and chestnuts a drumming, he laughed to see and hear its coming. By the time he was out from under the trees, he had leaves in his hair and down his back, and was kicking them up with every racing step. As he reached the porch, the first clouds he'd seen all afternoon crept over the sun, and their shadow made the house, which had wavered in the heat of the afternoon like a mirage, suddenly loom, dark and solid. "You're real," he said, as he stood panting on the porch. "You are, aren't you?" He started to laugh at the foolishness of talking to a house, but the smile went from his face as a voice, so soft he was barely certain he heard it, said, "What do you think, child?" He looked for the speaker, but there was nobody at the threshold, nor out on the porch, nor on the steps behind him. "Who said that?" he demanded. There was no answer, which he was glad of. It hadn't been a voice at all, he told himself. It had been a creak of the boards underfoot, or the rustling of dry leaves in the grass. But he stepped into the house with his heart beating a little faster, reminding himself as he went that questions weren't welcome here. What did it matter anyway, he thought, whether this was a real place or a dream? It felt real, and that was all that mattered. Satisfied with this, he raced through the house into the kitchen, where Mrs. Griffin was weighing down the table with treats. Chapter 6. Seen and Unseen. "Well," said Wendell as they ate, "what are you going to be tonight?" "I don't know," Harvey said. "What are you going to be?" "A hangman," he said with a spaghetti grin. "I've been learning how to tie nooses. Now all I've got to do is find someone to hang." He eyed Miss Griffin. "It's quick," he said. "You just drop 'em and snap. Their necks break." "That's horrible," Mrs. Griffin said. "Why do boys always love talking about ghosts and murders and hangings?" "Because it's exciting," Wendell said. "You're monsters," she replied with a hint of a smile. "That's what you are, monsters." "Harvey is," Wendell said. "I've seen him filing down his teeth." "Is it a full moon?" Harvey said, smearing ketchup around his mouth and putting on a twitch. "I hope so. I need blood. Fresh blood."
"Good," said Wendell. "You could be a vampire. I'll hang 'em, and you can suck their blood."
"Horrible," Mrs. Griffin said again. "Just horrible." Perhaps the house had heard Harvey wishing for a full moon, because when he and Wendell traipsed upstairs and looked out the landing window, there, hanging between the bare branches of the trees, was a moon as wide and as white as a dead man's smile. "Look at it," Harvey said. "I can see every crater. It's perfect."
"Oh, that's just the start,"
Wendell promised, and led Harvey to a large, musty room which had been filled with clothes of every description. Some were hung on hooks and coat hangers, some were in baskets like actors' costumes. Still more were heaped at the far end of the room on the dusty floor. And, half hidden until Wendell cleared the way, was a sight that made Harvey gasp. A wall covered from floor to ceiling with masks. "Where did they all come from?" Harvey said, as he gaped at this spectacle.
"Mr. Hood collects them," Wendell explained. "And the clothes are just stuff that kids who visited here left behind."
Harvey wasn't interested in the clothes. It was the masks that mesmerized him. They were like snowflakes, no two alike. Some were made of wood and of plastic, some of straw and cloth and paper mache. Some were as bright as parrots, others as pale as parchment. Some were so grotesque he was certain they'd been carved by crazy people. Others so perfect they looked like the death masks of angels. There were masks of clowns and foxes, masks like skulls decorated with real teeth, and one with carved flames instead of hair.
"Take your pick," said Wendell. "There's bound to be a vampire somewhere. Whatever I come in here wanting to find, I find it sooner or later."
Harvey decided to leave the pleasure of choosing a mask until last, and concentrated instead on digging up something suitably bat-like to wear. As he worked through the piles of clothes, he found himself wondering about the children who'd left them here. Though he'd always hated history lessons, he knew some of the jackets and shoes and shirts and belts had been out of fashion for many, many years. Where were their owners now? Dead, he presumed, or so old it made no difference. The thought of these garments belonging to dead folk brought a little shudder to his spine, which was only right. This was Halloween, after all, and what was Halloween without a few chills? After a few minutes of searching, he found a long black coat with a collar he could turn up, which Wendell pronounced very vampiric. Well satisfied with his choice, he went back to the wall of faces, and his eyes almost immediately alighted upon a mask he hadn't previously seen, with the pallor and deep sockets of a soul just risen from the tomb. He took it down and put it on. It fitted perfectly. "What do I look like?" Harvey asked, turning to face Wendell, who had found an executioner's mask which fitted him just as well.
"Ugly as sin."
"Good." There was a flickering family of pumpkin heads lined up on the porch when they stepped outside, and the misty air smelled of wood smoke. "Where do we go trick-or-treating?" Harvey wanted to know. Out in the street?
No, said Wendell. It's not Halloween out in the real world, remember? We're going to go around to the back of the house.
That's not very far, Harvey remarked, disappointed.
It is at this time of night, Wendell said creepily. This house is full of surprises. You'll see.
Harvey looked up at the house through the tiny eye holes of his mask. It loomed as large as a thunderhead, its weather vane sharp enough to stab the stars.
Come on, said Wendell. We've got a long trip ahead.
A long trip? Harvey thought, how could it be a long trip from the front of the house to the back? But once again, Wendell was right. The house was full of surprises. The trip, which would have been a 2-minute walk in the bright afternoon, soon became a trek that had Harvey wishing he'd brought a flashlight and a map. The leaves rustled underfoot as though snakes were swarming through them. The trees that had shaded them by day now looked frightful in their nakedness, gaunt and hungry. Why am I doing this? He asked himself as he followed Wendell through the darkness. I'm cold and I'm uncomfortable. He might have added frightened to the list, but he left that thought unsaid. As he was about to suggest they turn back, Wendell pointed up and hissed. Look! Harvey looked. Directly overhead, a form was moving silently against the sky, as if it had just launched itself from the eaves of the house. The moon had slunk away behind the roof and shed no light upon this night flyer, so Harvey could only guess at its shape from the stars it blotted out as it sailed. Its wings were wide but ragged. Too ragged to bear it up, he thought. Instead, it seemed to claw at the darkness as it went, as though it were crawling on the very air itself. A glimpse was all Harvey had. Then it was gone. What was that? He whispered. He got no answer. In the moments he'd taken staring up at the sky, Wendell had disappeared. Wendell? Harvey whispered. Where are you? There was still no reply, just the slithering in the leaves and the moan of hungry branches. I know what you're doing, Harvey said louder this time. And you won't scare me that easy. Hear me? This time there was a reply of sorts. Not words, but a creaking sound from somewhere in the trees. He's climbing up into the treehouse, Harvey thought, and determined to catch Wendell and scare him back, he followed the sound. Despite the nakedness of the branches, their mesh kept all but a glimmer of starlight from falling on the groves. He slipped his mask down around his neck so as to see a little better. But even then he was nearly blind, and had to listen out for the sound of Wendell's ascent to guide him. He could still hear the creaks plainly enough, and stumbled in their direction, his arms outstretched to grasp the ladder when he reached it. Now the sound was so loud, he was certain he must be standing beneath the tree. He looked up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the trickster, but as he did so, something brushed his face. He snatched at it, but it was gone, at least for the moment. Then it came again, brushing his brow from the other side. He snatched at it a second time, then, as it touched him again, caught hold of it. Got you, he cried. His yell of triumph was followed by a rush of air, and the sound of something crashing to the ground at his side. He jumped, but refused to let go of whatever he was holding. Wendell, he called. By way of a reply, a flame flared in the darkness behind him, and a firework erupted into a shower of green sparks, its light making a gangrenous cavern of the grove. By its flickering light he saw what he held, and seeing, let out a panicked yammering that had the crows rising from their roosts overhead. It was not a ladder he'd heard creaking, it was a rope. No, not even a rope, a noose. And in his hand, the leg of the man hanging from the noose. He let go of it and stumbled backward, barely suppressing a second shout as his eyes rose to meet the dead man's stare. To judge by his expression, he had died horribly. His tongue lolled from his foamy lips. His veins were so swollen with blood his head looked like a pumpkin. Either that, or it was a pumpkin. A fresh fountain of sparks now burst from the firework, and Harvey saw the truth of the matter. The limb he'd held was a stuffed trouser leg, the body a coat spilling bundles of clothes. That head, a mask on a pumpkin, with cream for spittle and eggs for eyes. "Wendell!" he yelled, turning his back on the scene of execution. Wendell was standing on the far side of the firework, his ear-to-ear grin lit by its spitting sparks. He looked like a little demon, fresh from the inferno. At his side was the ladder that had come crashing down to get the drama underway.
I warned ya,
Wendell said, holding up his mask.
I said I was going to be a hangman tonight.
"I'll get you back for this," Harvey said, his heart still beating too fast for him to see the funny side of this. "I swear, I'll get you back."
You can try,
Wendell crowed. The firework was beginning to fizzle out, the shadows around them beginning to deepen again.
Had enough of Halloween for tonight?
He asked. Harvey didn't much like admitting defeat, but he nodded grimly, swearing to himself that when he finally got his revenge, it would be choice.
Smile,
Wendell said, as the fountain of sparks dwindled.
We're in the holiday house.
The light had almost gone, and even though Harvey was still enraged at Wendell, and at himself for being such a sucker, he couldn't let it die away without making peace. "All right," he said, allowing himself a tiny smile. "There'll be other nights."
Always,
said Wendell. The reply pleased him.
That's what this place is,
he said, as the light went out.
It's the house of always.
All right, so let's talk about this. So chapter 7, I decided to wait until the next lesson. It was getting a little bit long. So the first thing I want to talk about are how the problems are leading to more problems in the story. When it starts off, Harvey is having a hard time. He's feeling kind of bad. On page 5, I want to read you a passage because I think it's important. It says, "I've got nothing better to do," Harvey said, without looking round. "Well then, you can make yourself useful," his mom said. Harvey shuddered. Useful? That was another word for hard labor. He sprang up, marshalling his excuses. He hadn't done this, he hadn't done that, but it was too late. "You can start by tidying up your room," his mom said. "But don't sit wishing the days away, dear. Life's too short." I think that line, "Don't sit wishing the days away, dear, life's too short," is really important here. For one thing, I noticed that it's foreshadowing. Another thing is that this is, as I see it, his first problem in the story. He's having a hard time being inspired, wanting to do anything. So then he has this problem. The next problem comes when Rictus arrives. And Rictus has, an offer for him, but it comes with another problem. He's not supposed to ask questions. As you recall on page 9, it says, "Could you take me there?" "We said no questions, boy. We agreed." "Oh yeah, I'm sorry." So this not asking questions becomes a bigger and bigger problem because, as you've noticed at the holiday house, things are a bit odd. And any thinking person would want to ask questions, right? Which takes us to Wendell. I love Wendell. Wendell is hilarious to me, but he is also a problem in a regard because he is Harvey's friend, but Wendell's mantra is, I will find it for you on page 43. So Harvey's asking about the fish in the water. And he says, "Why would Mr. Hood have fish like that? I mean, everything else here is so beautiful. The lawns, the house, the orchard." "Who cares?" says Wendell. So Wendell's "who cares," and I can't capture it as well as it does in Audible, so thank you, Audibles. But Wendell's response always is "who cares," which is a sign of him not necessarily thinking about the problems, and it doesn't help Harvey, who has so many questions. And it takes us to page 51, when Harvey continues to ask these questions, which he's not getting adequate responses. It says, let's see. It's when he is walking in Halloween from the front of the house to the back of the house, and it's beginning to take a little bit too long, right? And it says, "Why am I doing this?" he asked himself as he followed Wendell through the darkness. "I'm cold, I'm uncomfortable," and he might have added frightened to the list, but he left that thought unsaid. As he was about to suggest, they turned back, and Wendell pointed up and hissed, "Look!" Harvey looked directly overhead. A form was moving silently against the sky, as if it just launched itself from the eaves of the house. I would continue, but you remember that basically Harvey is frightened, he's scared, and he's wondering, why am I doing this? And he's not asking a lot of questions out loud, he's just thinking this now. So you can see his problems continue to get larger. We'll continue to look at this. The last thing I wanted us to talk about today is when the characters are asking questions, we should be learning with the characters. There's some really important things that have happened thus far when Harvey is asking questions. On page 36, I'm trying to go fast because my children are going to find me soon, and the dog has already found me. He can hear me, and they're all looking for me to feed them. Again, I feed them every 30 minutes, I swear. All right, page 36. This is when the cat died, Clue-Cat, I believe it was, and it's when Harvey is discussing with Miss Griffin about the cat dying. "Oh, look at you, child," Miss Griffin says. "You've got tears on your cheeks." Harvey blushed and wiped them away with the back of his hand. "Don't be ashamed to weep," Miss Griffin said. "It's a wonderful thing. I wish I could shed a tear or two." "You're sad," Harvey said. "I can see that." "Well, what I feel is not quite sadness," Miss Griffin replied. "And it's not much solace either, I'm afraid." "What solace?" Harvey asked. "It's something soothing," Miss Griffin said, getting to her feet. "Something that heals the pain in your heart." "And you don't have any of that?" "No, I don't," Miss Griffin said. She reached out and touched Harvey's cheek. "Except maybe in these tears of yours. They comfort me." She sighed as she traced their tracks with her fingers. "Your tears are sweet, child, and so are you. Now, you go into the light and enjoy yourself. There's sun on the step, and it won't be there forever, believe me." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." "I'll see you later then," Harvey said. So Harvey's asking some questions. He asked about what is solace. He asked about why she doesn't feel any pain. And those are important questions. We noticed that Miss Griffin said that she doesn't have sadness, but she also doesn't have pain. Hello. So that's an important one. The next thing I want to talk about, because they're coming, I can feel it, is on page 45. I'm having to hide to do my work. Maybe you are having to hide from having to do work. We all have our issues, right? All right, page 45. So this is after Halloween. No. This is when Harvey is walking into the house, and he says to the house, "You're real," he says, as he stood panting on the porch. "You are, aren't you?" He started to laugh at the foolishness of talking to a house, but the smile from his face went, From soft to, what do you think, child? He looked for the speaker, but there was nobody at the threshold, nor out on the porch, nor on the steps behind them. Who said that? He demanded. There was no answer. This is an important one because although Harvey hasn't learned a lot yet, he's asking some important questions. And when your character is asking those questions, I want you to pay close attention because that is a device for us to pay particular attention to. Okay? We want to read, and we want to read carefully. Ooh, I knew they were coming. I knew it. Just a minute. I'm almost done, okay? You want cereal and milk?
Rice Krispies.
You want Rice Krispies. Okay, just a second. All right, so I want you to pay particular attention to those things. Pay attention to when the problems lead to more problems, and also when the characters are asking questions. Pay particular attention to those. Oh, there's more. They're coming out of the woodwork. All right, get to work, y'all. I have to go make breakfast. Bye-bye.